Okay, so hey guys, and welcome back to another Axel 72 video, and in today's video I'm going to be giving my prediction for the Belal Muhammad versus Jack Della Maddalena fight. And so if you are new around here and you haven't yet subscribed, please do so, like video if you do indeed like video, and let's get straight into this. So this is of course Belal Muhammad's first defense of his welterweight UFC title, which of course is on the line for this fight, and it's not a bad first defense. Obviously, it's not what everybody was wanting slash expecting. Everybody was first expecting, of course, Jack Della Maddalena to then go on to fight, of course, Leon Edwards. Sorry, my mind went blank for a minute there. But then, obviously, Rakhmonov was meant to go on to fight Belal Muhammad. Rakhmonov obviously had to pull out due to an injury and due to a smart little adjustment by the UFC, which, to be fair, I think has only realistically played out in their favour. They have decided, of course, they had Leon Edwards go on and fight Sean Brady instead, and they put in Jack Della Maddalena in for a title shot. I think it makes complete sense. Obviously, Sean Brady went out and put on a very good performance versus Leon, and realistically has showcased that there might not be too much left in Leon Edwards' career, and perhaps underlined maybe probably did beat Leon then better than what Belal did. And so, like I say, underlined the kind of thing of maybe Sean Brady should be next in line for a title shot, and he is number one ranked contender, but it's not going to happen realistically, and we weren't going to see Sean Brady come in for Rakhmonov to fight Belal Muhammad due to the fact of course, Belal Muhammad, his last stoppage victory was against Sean Brady, where he did look really good in that fight, Belal. And so, it's definitely hindered him a lot, Sean Brady, that fight, to be completely honest. And I feel like Sean Brady is realistically really wanting, if not Rakhmonov, then Jack Della Maddalena to win this title, because I feel like for as long as Belal is the champion, I don't think he's going to get a title shot unless he goes on to fight, another two more top contenders fights. But when you look down the list of, challengers available, he won't be able to fight Rakhmonov. Usman and Buckley have a fight booked. Edwards is there, but he's of course just beaten Edwards. Della Maddalena is there, but of course he's in for a title shot now. Ian Gary is there. Possibly that fight could happen then, but then we're going down to, the sixth, seventh position in the welterweight rankings. And so, realistically, Brady isn't going to be wanting to give that opportunity to somebody like an Ian Gary, but that might be the only kind of option of a fight he'll get because of the fact that Belal for the moment is champion. It seems like there is a lot riding on this fight in the way of, who fights who next. There's even been talks that the winner of this fight, if Belal wins this fight, then he could go on to fight Makhachev next. And there is possible talks of the fact of, if, like I say, if Belal wins, he could be, just online waiting for Makhachev to then step in. Makhachev could be waiting around to see the winner of this fight. If Jack wins, he might not be too interested in that fight because it might not be seen as big of a money fight for him. But if Belal wins, then he's defended his title once, he's cemented himself as a champion. Yes, he does train with Makhachev, which does make it a little bit difficult because Habib doesn't want Makhachev to fight Belal. So, like I said, that perhaps makes it a little bit difficult. But, there has been talks about the fact that Makhachev could be on the line waiting for the winner of this fight to then announce that he's going to fight the winner of this fight. And, if, Jack maybe wins, then perhaps he might fight Topuri instead. If Belal wins, perhaps he might fight Topuri instead. There is a few things being worked out seemingly behind the scenes with Makhachev, and we're waiting to hear about a certified opponent, locked-in opponent. It seems like it might be for International Fight Week because we are in need of an International Fight Week, big main event, because I feel like the UFC always wants to deliver a big main event for International Fight Week. It's one of the, major fight weeks on the calendar, but they are missing out on that so far. But that'll happen. Whatever happens with that, I'm sure will probably be announced in this pay-per-view. But of course, this is UFC 315. It's realistically a pretty solid card. I think, it has got two title fights on it. It seems like the UFC likes to quite regularly have two title fights on, or have, one good title fight on and then have one good top contenders fight on, or one entertaining matchup on, because you look at the last pay-per-view, we had Volkanovski Lopez, and then we had just underneath that we had Pimlet Chandler, which, like I say, wasn't a highly ranked contenders fight, but it was two guys that was definitely going to make for an entertaining clash, and it was going to get the eyes of the fans, and it definitely did that. So this one's a bit different. Like I say, it has two title fights on, but perhaps on paper you could argue that maybe both of these fighters might not be the most entertaining for fans. Belal, he's had a lot of disrespect upon his name. Perhaps that means that he might be coming into this fight. You could argue this with every single one of his performances. Perhaps he might be coming into this fight as his first defense. Now he's won the title. Maybe he wanted to win the title against Leon in just any kind of fashion possible, because of course, that's winning the title, and he's waited a while for this opportunity. But now he's getting his first defense against, on paper, an easier opponent than what Rachmanov was. Perhaps he might be wanting to go out there and really put on a statement and showcase that he deserves to be a champion and cement himself, because, a lot of people were writing him off against Shavkat, and, Shavkat has been looking really good, but he, showed perhaps slight weaknesses to an extent against Ian Gary, and, like I say, perhaps he was getting not overhyped, but there, like I said, there was a high expectation on him to have really caused a lot of problems to Belal. But now this fight obviously is now changed. On paper, we have the easier opponent in Della Maddalena. Like I say, if Muhammad wins this one, then he's gone and defended his title. Then if he goes on to fight Rachmanov, then, perhaps at least then he's had one defense under this title. He's not been a champion who's just won the belt, lost it straight away. At least, like I say, he's had one defense under his belt. If he ends up going unbeaten, Rachmanov, then he is a certified, very good champion, and a name that should be more respected, because there's been a lot of, memes and jokes and people just poking fun at Belal Muhammad, which is a shame, because he is a quality fighter, and there's been the whole things that he doesn't know how to hold the belt. When he was trying to get into the ring, and the security was stopping him because they didn't know who he was. There has been a lot of things that perhaps haven't gone into his favor in the way of making his public image seem as a good, respected champion. But he needs to go out and do that with his performances. And if he goes out and puts on a statement victory versus Della Maddalena, then realistically, even if he goes on to win via unanimous decision, which a lot of people have been saying, that's what, of course, he's kind of traditionally known for. If he goes on, and even if he wins via unanimous decision, if he wins convincingly, then to an extent, yes, people can still say that Rachmanov is going to be able to beat him and things like that, and just say that Della Maddalena is not the top contender. But it's still a very good victory to have if Belal is able to win. Obviously, as a stylistic matchup, it's a bit of a different matchup. I mean, Belal, of course, is very much known for being able to get his takedowns in. I think his striking on the feet is improving. I don't think he throws many kicks, and I don't think his striking is that varied. I think it is limited. He's got a solid jab, but there isn't really too much behind it. He wants to try and throw his boxing, but in a fight like this, I think he really shouldn't be throwing his boxing. Against Jack Della Maddalena, he's somebody who realistically kind of has come out of nowhere to an extent, because when you look at what he's done so far in the UFC in recent times, his major performances, you kind of look at his past two fights. The Kevin Holland fight was a split decision where Kevin Holland was just kind of lazily walking backwards and, doing little movements that was able to catch Della Maddalena from, or stop Della Maddalena from being able to land and things like that. He wasn't doing anything too crazy. He was having success at range at times. Della Maddalena did well with his accuracy, but it wasn't an amazingly good performance. But that maybe made fans question a little bit. Was he ready for a top contender? Then he went on to fight Gilbert Burns. Yes, that was Burns when perhaps he was on, he is arguably on the latter side of his career at the moment, and that perhaps wasn't the best Gilbert Burns, but he did go on to stop him, and he looked like he was having success. He looked like he could handle himself on the ground. He was getting taken down, and he perhaps wasn't really putting himself in positions that were the best, but he could get up. He wasn't getting too badly damaged on the ground, or he wasn't really getting that close to being submitted. Like I say, he could handle himself on the ground. Saying how much striking we've seen from him, he is a very good striker, and he definitely was out striking and landing better than Muhammad. not Mohammed, I mean Burns, he definitely was doing that, and he does have good, crisp boxing where he isn't loading up on loads of punches. It's not the most powerful, but it's nice combinations in which will look good, and they will land and they will look clean. Yes, again, he's not somebody that's going to really throw too much in the way of kicks and too varied of attacks, but in boxing, his boxing is by far better than that of Mohammed's, in my opinion. But the wrestling will, of course, play a factor. I think Mohammed, if he is going to get hurt, I think he got, rocked and hurt a little bit against Leon Edwards. And this was an Edwards in which, we saw on that fight that he didn't look the best. And, I mean, we saw against Brady that he really didn't look that good either. But his timing was off. He did look quite vulnerable quite a lot of the time. He looked quite weak, and he was still having relatively bits of success against Muhammad. I mean, when he was striking, he was able to damage Muhammad, and of course, he cut open his head as well. And like I say, he was able to damage him. Della Maddalena could very much damage Muhammad if he tries to box him and prove that he's some sort of boxer, Muhammad. It wouldn't surprise me if Muhammad does go on to, rely on his laurels and go for a wrestling display. I think his wrestling is very good. I think he showcased that again versus Edwards in a very good fashion where, he's really good at locking his hands when he gets the double leg or, even a single leg. Something which is so impressive is how well he can lock his hands, and you can see how focused he is at doing that. To be able to get you to the ground, the best way to showcase that strength is to be able to lock you to the ground. And the way that he was able to, at one point, drop Leon Edwards onto his head by just going in between his legs, locking his hands, and just throwing him onto the ground realistically. It shows physical strength, but also shows the IQ that he does have with his wrestling. So he is an underrated wrestler. I think, like I say, I think the fans want to see him put in that bit more of an entertaining performance, even if it is just better ground and pound work, that bit more of a violent performance from him, which we haven't really seen too much of in recent times, bar the Brady performance, which, like I say, I think was a very standout performance for himself and definitely has aged very well. But, similarly to that of a Dwalishvili, he gets a lot of hate due to the fact of the striking isn't really that good of his, and he doesn't really cause too much of a violent performance when he is going on and attacking. He just completely out staminas you and out wrestles you, and just, like I say, just doesn't ever stop coming to you. And Muhammad can do that. He will bring that pressure. But, he should maybe take a bit of a notebook out of Marab's book and, try and be that bit more entertaining for the fans. If he has you in a dominant position and, he can catch Jack out with his wrestling and he can get him to the ground, because I do believe he is the physically stronger guy out of the two, then why not, do a little bit of, I don't know, taunting to an extent, or try and showcase that he is going to be entertaining for the fans, because otherwise fans are going to tune out and aren't really going to be as willing to watch him and are just going to root against him and are just, it's not going to go into his favour. And I think he could very easily, like I say, if he gets behind his wrestling and he relies on what he does really well, then he can have success and he can put on an entertaining performance at the same time, which I would like to see. I think that Muhammad's going to be able to win by unanimous decision. I think, like I say, he's going to rely on his wrestling. If things get difficult on the feet, he's going to go down to his wrestling and he's going to be the physically stronger. He's going to be able to interlock his fingers and get him to the ground. And like I say, have success from doing that. Just, probably hold him there. But like I say, just put on that bit more of an entertaining performance. Then who he goes on to fight next, possibly somebody like a Gary could be a good fight. And Usman versus Buckley, the winner of that could be a good fight. But he does have to get through Rachmanov. There's no kind of swerving around that, and I think Belal knows that. Perhaps a Makachev fight could maybe come in and jump that instead, but we as fans probably would want to see the Rachmanov fight. Then if Rachmanov is able to beat Muhammad, like a lot of people are expecting, then give Makachev the opportunity to fight there. I feel like when there is one clear contender still left in the division, we need to wait for him to go on to fight the champion before we see any of the other champions come up to fight them, because I feel like that's just what's fair. Yes, Makachev has beaten so many guys in the lightweight division and has been on a great run, but just wait a little bit longer. He's got people trying to challenge him. Even if he doesn't fight Topuria, fight Sarukian, fight Gaethje, fight Oliveira, fight any of them guys. instead of perhaps, wait a little bit longer if he's going to fight Muhammad, in my opinion. That's just what I think. But, moving on to the co-main event, which is, of course, the UFC flyweight title, which is Valentina Shevchenko versus Manon Fiorot, which is, in my opinion, a solid matchup. I think it's a fight in which is long overdue. I mean, Fiorot beat Blanchfield quite a while ago in a top contenders kind of fight. I don't believe it was for the number one contendership because, of course, that's where Grasso is. But like I say, it still was a top contenders matchup. And, she did look good in that fight. She was counterpunching quite well and she was using I like her long body kicks that she throws. And she is a solid fighter. But I think defensively there was some clear vulnerabilities. But I do think that, you know, Blanchfield wasn't going to be one of them fighters to be able to deal with that because she was so much physically smaller than that of Fiorot and, not having that strength anywhere near so of that of Fiorot. So for somebody like a Shevchenko, yes, Shevchenko isn't the biggest, isn't the strongest of fighters, but she has that level of experience which is way superior to anybody in which Fiorot has ever faced. And she's coming off a trilogy kind of war set of fights versus Grasso where she lost via submission, she then drew, she then dominated in the last fight, and she was able to really showcase her ground game in that performance versus Grasso where, you got to give her credit for that because she kept going to the ground versus Grasso, and even when she made a few mistakes at times, she put herself in vulnerable positions, but she was still able to get the back. She was still going for submissions, even when she had a couple times where she almost got choked out. She still went to keep going, and you got to think. When in the first fight, of course, she lost via submission, there was them demons for sure there, and she definitely was getting flashbacks. So you can only, believe that she was when she was getting, close to being tapped out in that last fight, which she won. But she still kept going. She still kept persisting. She could see that pretty much every time she went for a takedown, she would have success. And I think that's a route to victory in which she can have against him like a Fiorot. I think, yes, it's going to be interesting to see how she can deal with the size of Fiorot and if she can get her down to the ground. But I believe if she can do that, then I think she can win via submission. I think she will be able to do that. I think, if not, I think she could strike with Fiorot. She's a much better mover. She's a much faster striker, and I think she's a more varied striker as well. She'll have to be wary for, like I say, the very nice body kicks that Fiorot throws and the counter punches that she'll come in with. She can't be doing anything stupid, but I think she can definitely win via submission in round 4. I think if she, like I say, can go to the ground, I don't think that Fiorot has faced anybody who's going to be willing to go to the ground, and even if she doesn't have success on the ground, keep going to the ground, keep trying, being persistent, and being able to, like I say, wear her down. This is, of course, her first, I believe, 5 round contest. Actually, it might be her second, but still, I think Shevchenko is going to prove her experience, prove herself as a world champion, and I think she's going to prove herself to the fans as well. Obviously, from what we've seen from the trilogy, it ended really impressively for Shevchenko, and that was at the UFC Not Chair at the Sphere, so it was in front of a big audience. But I think she really needs to get the fans back on her side convincingly with this type of a performance, and she's been long overdue a stoppage victory, and I think she's going to get a stoppage victory here. I think she is going to be able to submit Fiorot via submission in round 4. I think Grasso has got better submission ground game than that of a Fiorot. So I think she will, like I say, be able to submit her and then be able to have, plenty of success on the ground to then, like I say, lead on to a submission victory and, utilise the long limbs against Fiorot. And then, like I say, make that statement victory and get the fans back on their side, believing in her. Because, when you've got somebody like a Zhang Wei Li breathing down your neck in the pound for pound rankings, really with every performance putting on a great victory after great victory, you have to keep stepping up your game. Yes, Shevchenko has fought a higher, level of opposition for a longer time than that of Zhang, but she has to keep, the fans on her side with performances, proving that when a fighter isn't quite ready to fight at a world level, then, proving that she is better, proving that she is that level above. And I think she can do that in this performance. Of course, everybody would like to see Zhang go on to fight Shevchenko at some point. Of course, there's the weight difference, Zhang being the smaller at strawweight, but that definitely could happen. I feel like that is possibly one of the only kind of real fights left for Shevchenko in this division. I feel like there's not really matchups that make too much sense. Yes, Grasso is on this card fighting Silva, Yes, that's nice to see that Grasso's on this card. The UFC have done well with UFC for 315, putting some big names on the, you know, undercard below the co-main. And Grasso is a good fight to have on against Natalie Silva. Silva's an up-and-comer. If she beats Grasso, perhaps, she could go in line to fight Shevchenko. If Grasso wins convincingly, perhaps she could get a fourth fight against Shevchenko. Something like a Blanchfield perhaps could be an option. Yes, she lost to Fiorot, but I think that was definitely a stylistic matchup that didn't suit her, of course, with the size. But she went on to then, in my opinion, quite surprisingly beat Namajunas and win in an impressive fashion there. So that could definitely go on to be a fight as well. So, like I say, lots of great fights there. Like I say, the main fight in which us as fans want to see is, of course, the two pound for pound on paper best women's fighters against each other in Shevchenko and Zhang. So, hopefully, we will see that at some point. And, just to speak about a couple of other fights on this card, like I spoke about, Grasso is on this card in a good fight versus Natalie Silva, which I'm excited to see. Jose Aldo is on this card, making yet again another return against Ayman Zahabi, which is, he's a ranked 15th contender in the bantamweight division. So it will be interesting to see how Aldo does. Aldo is coming off the loss versus Martinez, and so yeah, it's interesting to see what they've done with Jose Aldo. I'm not going to be giving predictions about these fights, but I just wanted to touch upon it a little bit. It is interesting to see what they've done with this comeback for Aldo. Aldo is a legend, and there's no doubt about it. I mean, he is arguably one of the best featherweights ever, and you can't, like I say, disagree with that. He was one of the people that put the featherweight division on the map, and he's just not getting this respect and this comeback in which I feel like he deserves, where you know, he could have come in and with this return and gotten given matchups against maybe a Henry Cejudo, who yes hasn't been on a great run, but is a legend in himself for what he's achieved, or a Cody Garbrandt, similar kind of position as well. Not achieved as much as a Cejudo, but that could have been a great fight to have as well, and that would have given the fans more hype. Maybe that's Jose Aldo's decision not to take fights like that, but I feel like the UFC definitely could have given him opportunities like that due to the name in which he has. I give Aldo the credit for wanting to take these fights against these up and coming fighters to, prove that he can still fight at a high level. But if he does lose this one, then I do think that probably should be, realistically the end of his career. Another fight in which is on this card, which has had a little bit of controversy, I suppose, surrounding it, is Benoit Saint Denis versus Kyle Polek. I don't know too much about Propolek. I mean, I know he had a stint in the UFC, I believe around 2019. It might have been around that time, and he had two defeats. He's on a good run of first round knockouts outside of the UFC, but now he's having a return. Canadian fighter, I believe, and he's fighting Benoit Saint Denis. And Saint Denis, of course, is coming off the loss versus Moicano, and that was a bad, defeat for him. And the loss to Poirier before that, he was on a good run at one point, but now he is fading away a little bit. And if he loses to Kyle, then that is really put him out of his UFC career. He could get cut from the roster if he loses this fight. And he was meant to fight Joe Alvarez, but that of course didn't happen. I believe Alvarez got an injury of some kind and he had to drop out. That's not that would have been a good matchup. I think that would have been a fair matchup. But what was interesting was the fact that Gamrot, who is is a good ranked fighter, was clearly, strangely, I think, in my opinion, I think he could have called out any fighter, but he called out Saint Denis, and he was, positively wanting to fight him. Was it, contractual talks that went and, something went wrong with that? Or, I don't know, but why not fight something like a Gamrot? Why fight something like a Prepolek? Yes, he's coming off two losses. Maybe he wants a fight which is on paper a bit of an easier contest. But if he'd have lost versus Gamrot, yes, Gamrot would have been coming in on short notice. But if he'd have lost, then it wouldn't have done awful things for his resume. If he loses to Prepolek coming in on short notice, then like I say, he could get cut from the UFC as a result of that. So it's just interesting to see why not take the opportunity against Gamrot. That could really propel his career. If he is able to win that fight, then Gamrot, like I say, is a great name who has gotten some really significant wins in the UFC. Why not, take that risk? There's no harm in taking that risk, and that, like I say, could really propel you into the UFC rankings again and get you back in the scene. So it's just interesting to see why we haven't seen that happen, but nonetheless, that we're having to deal with this fight that's happening instead. But yeah, that is it for today's video. Hope you'd enjoy. Like video if you did need like video, subscribe if you're new, and thanks for watching.